Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm chairing session 5, which is cultivations and weeds. And you'll probably be pleased to know we're at the end of the last session in what has been a very busy day. Okay, I have 2 presentations and a panel discussion to get through. And I think the people on the sound are looking for John Cousins, if John could make his way over in your own time, just to get mic'd up. But before that, Teagasc researcher Vijay Bhaskar is going to talk about resistance and the various challenges that we have in Ireland. And I think for most people, unless you were completely head in the sand for the last number of years, we will be increasingly aware of the problem and the challenges that grassweeds are bringing to us in this country. So Vijay, when you are ready, please.
Thanks, Andy. I suppose many of you are familiar with the ECT or Enable Conservation Tillage project. And as a part of this project, we conducted a survey to identify the extent of grassweed problems across country. 103 farms were identified, of which 62 were plough-based and 41 non-inversion tillage in the main southeast tillage regions. The percentage of the surveyed farm in each county is shown on the map. The survey had 3 components: assessing grassweed pressure on the farm, collecting samples for resistance work, and lastly, interviewing growers to record weed control tactics used on each farm. Let's move into the first component of the survey, which is grassweed assessment. Among 103 farms we surveyed, bromes and spring wild oats were the most prevalent, found on more than 50% of the farms, while the likes of blackgrass and Italian ryegrass were found on 15% of the farm, indicating an increase in incidence of these 2 critical species in particular. Next, we determined the population pressure of each of these species in different systems. In front, you have the bromes. The weed pressure results are presented on a map on an establishment system basis. 53% of the plough farm and 77% of the non-inversion tillage farm had brome as their #1 problem weed. The marker color on the map indicating weed pressure is based on weed score from 0 to 10, where 0 indicate absence of weed and 10 indicate highest weed density. As you can see clearly, many of the plough farm had low brome pressure indicated by blue marker compared to non-inversion tillage farm. This shows that brome frequency and weed pressure tend to increase with less soil disturbance compared to full soil inversion. Next, we have the wild oats. The frequency of wild oats were similar in both the systems, which was quite expected. Even the population pressure were similar. With the exception of few farms, many of the farms in both the systems had low wild oat pressure at the time of our survey, as indicated by blue marker. Next, we have the Italian ryegrass. Especially in non-inversion tillage farms, where Italian ryegrass was found, they had the highest weed density, as indicated by marker color yellow to red, and those population also developed resistance compared to plough-based farm. Similar to brome, less soil disturbance tend to increase the weed pressure of Italian ryegrass and possibly contributing to resistance in Italian ryegrass. And lastly, we have the blackgrass. I suppose, as you know, the situation of blackgrass is quite complex. Even though many of the plough-based farm had more cases of blackgrass, the occurrence of blackgrass is more to do with the location rather than crop establishment systems. In general, many of the farms in both the systems had low blackgrass pressure indicated by blue marker. Nevertheless, the samples we tested showed resistance. This shows that low blackgrass pressure doesn't mean minimizing resistance risk, unlike we saw in other species like bromes and spring wild oats in previous few slides. It is also important to mention that 38% of growers didn't know they had blackgrass until we identified. And there are high likelihood that there are more farms out there with blackgrass yet to be identified. Let's move into the second component of the survey, which is resistance analysis. Our glasshouse work identified 18 farms having herbicide-resistant grass weeds. Out of 18 farms, 3 farms had 2 or more resistant species indicated by red marker, and 15 farms had single resistant species indicated by blue marker. We now have resistance in plough as well as all forms of non-inversion tillage systems. As you can see, we have confirmed resistance cases in all major tillage counties in the Louth, Wexford, and Cork Triangle. Especially the multiple resistance in blackgrass pose a significant threat to crop production. Let's look into the profile of those resistant blackgrass. In front, you have the 5 suspect population, all coming from Dublin and Meath region, and they were tested with different ACKs and ALS herbicides. On your right, you have the untreated control, which was not exposed to herbicides, and at the bottom, you have the sensitive population, which was totally killed by ACKs and ALS herbicide types. If you look at the ALS herbicide types, both monolith and Pacifica had no impact on these 5 resistant population. Even the ACK's Falcon had no impact, and the highest impact was observed with ACK's Stratus Ultra, especially in R13, and in R9 and in R12, there were few surviving plants, and in R10 and R11, Stratus Ultra was virtually ineffective. Remember, these plants were sprayed at 2 to 3 leaf stage in a perfect glasshouse condition, which is quite different from field situation. Meaning, if the herbicide doesn't do job in these conditions, they won't probably work out in the field situation. So the next question we had, is there any herbicide left to control these resistant population? To answer this, we selected 4 population and tested with different dose rates of another ACK's herbicide type, Centurion Max or Clethodim, which is quite rarely used in Ireland. On your left, you have the untreated control, which was not exposed to Centurion Max, and moving from left to right, the dose rate increases from 0.25 to 2 times the recommended field rate. By the time you reach the recommended field rate, above 95% control has been achieved with Centurion Max. Currently, in the UK, the advice is to use metachlor-based products like Butisan or Catamaran, followed by propicimide or Curb, and then Centurion Max in oilseed rape to give every chance for the herbicide to eliminate the resistant population. But do remember that blackgrass can develop resistance rapidly to high-risk ACKs and ALS herbicide types. So to summarize the glasshouse findings, for controlling the resistant blackgrass, the control option is available only in non-cereal break crops with the likes of Centurion Max. And the situation is quite similar for resistant Italian ryegrass, where the control option is available only in oilseed rape with the likes of Stratus Ultra and Centurion Max. And with spring wild oats, we continue to see that ALS herbicide types with the likes of Pacifica, Broadway Star, or Monolith continue to provide effective control. And with bromes, we haven't documented any full resistant bromes yet, but there is a degree of tolerance or less sensitivity to these herbicides when they are used at reduced rate. But however, at full rate, they provide effective control. Let's move into the last component of the survey, which is weed management. So the black bars indicate plough farms, and the gray bars indicate non-inversion tillage farms. For the 3 strategy, rotating herbicide mode of action within crop rotation, or using full label rate, or use of stale seedbed strategy, we did not find any significant differences between systems. However, less than 50% of plough farms use full label rate and even stale seedbed strategy, requiring those farms to up their game against grass weeds. For the next 3 strategy, we found a significant difference between the systems. As you know, for sowing time, many of the non-inversion tillage farms tend to sow early to overcome crop establishment problems. However, they exacerbate grass weed problems. For the 2 types of crop rotation, whether it is a cereal and non-cereal break crop rotation or spring and winter sown rotation, 85% of non-inversion tillage farm practice these rotation compared to just above 50% of plough-based farm. So in summary, all the farms we surveyed implement IPM practices to some extent. Despite greater IPM adoption by non-inversion tillage farms, we are seeing the weed pressure and resistance increasing. So this important survey has identified a number of challenges in different systems in addition to generating for the first time the baseline information. There will be more challenges, as you know, with the likes of further reduction in herbicide chemistries, increasing non-inversion tillage adoption, emerging weeds, especially rat-tail fescue, which is naturally tolerant to all the ACKs and ALS herbicide types. And of course, increase in herbicide resistance in critical species like blackgrass and Italian ryegrass will make future weed control more difficult. So what next? We have to develop effective cultural and non-chemical weed control tactics to protect effective chemistries. But remember, this is not simple, and these methods are not well researched in our climate and systems. So our response is that we have started a new grassweed project called Evolve, which will evaluate and develop cultural and non-chemical weed control methods alongside resistance work, and there is more research expected in this area. So what we ask from you is stay vigilant, walk your crops, get your sample tested. As John used to say, you have only one chance every year to know which herbicide work for your population. So please get your samples tested and save the money. And lastly, implement all the good agricultural practices and on-farm hygiene. And lastly, we now have capacity to test any suspect weed samples. So please submit your sample either through your advisor or using the contact displayed in front. I thank all the ECT team for their support and guidance. I thank all the participating growers and the advisors for their help with the survey. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. Okay, in the course of the presentation, he mentioned a number of times about IPM, integrated pest management. When we're talking about weeds, we also use the term integrated weed management. And our next speaker is John Cousins from NIAB. And John's going to talk to us about how farmers in the UK are managing these difficult to control grass weeds. And John, we listen with interest because we know you've had a problem for longer than us. It would be great if you could tell us you'd succeeded.
So to answer the question very directly, how have we been using IWM to manage weeds? The answer is very, very badly to start with, much better more recently, and now as we see a very definite move to soil conservation management approaches, conservation agriculture, regen, we have a whole new set of challenges that we need to be aware of and a change in the balance of weed control. So we are perhaps further down the path of very herbicide-resistant grass weeds, problematic as a threat to sustainability for arable cropping. We saw the adoption of a package of agronomy, so intensive winter cereals, drilled earlier to get higher yields, substitution of ploughing with deep non-inversion, so not no-till or min-till, but deep non-inversion, lots of soil mixing, but no burial. This selected for blackgrass specifically, the system selected for the weed, and then having done that, we saw that poor herbicide practice selected for herbicide resistance very, very quickly. And then we reached a point where the weed itself was a threat to the sustainability of those systems. And we saw gradually a much better uptake of integrated weed management. Crucially, although I'm going to talk about some individual elements of IWM, the transition was about an increasing attention to detail and focus on the problem in order to implement the solution in practice. But as I say, what we see now is the beginning of a transition that presumably will gather pace towards no-till, soil conservation management systems, conservation agriculture systems, and these throw up a whole load of new challenges that need to be addressed. So my simple summary, there is a lot of data behind this slide in terms of where we are with grassweed resistance in the UK. So we have almost ubiquitous levels of resistance to ACCAs and ALS. Over 80% in seed collection surveys have resistance to these two traits. Italian ryegrass, I highlight, very widespread and increasing levels of herbicide resistance. And then other species, we have actually two species of wild oats. We see about 10 to 15% prevalence of resistance to some of these contacts. The things that I would highlight are that we are now picking up very rare, so a handful of cases, we're seeing ALS resistance in all the brome species. This makes these species very challenging to control in conservation ag systems. We're also, for the very first time, seeing a resistance trait emerge to a pre-emergence soil-acting herbicide rather than a contact herbicide. And these two things are really very worrying developments. Just to show you what this looks like, this is susceptible standard Italian ryegrass. This is one of these resistant populations treated in the glasshouse. So we see In a survey of about 200 samples, 10% of those samples were completely resistant to flufenicet in Italian ryegrass. So this is a really worrying development as we see so-called non-target site metabolic resistance begin to give rise to these resistance traits. We don't quite know where it's going to end, but it certainly points to a real challenge with respect to resistance in the future. So I've stolen this slide from my colleague Steve Moss. This is really our path out of very problematic blackgrass. Problems for growers was to really focus on the cultural element of weed management. And there are several key things, I'm not going to go through them line by line, that come from this. The first of all, this 5x5 emphasizes the long-term nature of integrated weed management. You're managing a seed bank, you're not managing a population in a field. And this is going to take long-term planning, bringing in the idea of risk management, not planting crops where you think the risk of the weed is very, very high. The other 5 emphasizes the need for us to combine different elements of cultural control together to get effectiveness. It's unlikely that if you adopt one element of this, whether it's delayed drilling, competitive crops, roguing, whatever, any one element is going to give you the results that you need to be sustainable. We need to combine these things together. And the other element is that part of the attention to detail that we saw increasingly adopted and better weed management outcomes included better attention to detail in the herbicide part of the weed management. Better timings, better product choice, better application equipment, better application technique all contributed to much better outcomes with respect to weed management. But so far, we've really focused on these cultural elements. And I'm going to pick out probably the 2 most effective and just show you a little bit of data in terms of the sort of successes that we're having. So this is an example of from an individual plant in an early drilled winter wheat crop in an experiment that we carried out in Cambridge, compared to these spring crops. And then if you combine the rotational management element of having a spring crop alongside in a winter rotation with crop competition, you can reduce the seed return further with spring barley. So we see consistently in field trials, and a lot of field trials and demonstrations, we can reduce the seed return from a blackgrass population by about 90%. We can increase that reduction still further by using a more competitive spring crop and combining 2 of these IWM elements together. What we found is that it's absolutely critical to manage the weed effectively in the spring phase of the rotation. It's all very well reducing the number of blackgrass plants that come into a crop, but if you don't effectively manage them in that crop, the strategy becomes less successful. So the other critical element was to reverse the trend towards ever earlier drilling of winter cereals. So we see, this is shows you all the data over 25 different drilling date trials. On average, we see about a 60% reduction per month in terms of the number of blackgrass plants that we're managing. But this comes along with an increase in herbicide performance that's associated with the later drilled crops. So 2 of the key elements that we've seen is a reversal of the trend towards earlier drilling and a more diversified rotation. And this has really helped, particularly for blackgrass management. So where we see the opportunities going forward, with cultural control, you do run out of road in terms of sustainability with respect to profitability. There's a limit to how many crops that you can grow that don't make you any money. There is a limit to how you can reduce yield in order to get better outcomes from weed management. We see the opportunities around introducing and diversifying weed management still further and investing in non-chemical direct weed management approaches in the future, particularly as we see this transition to no-till and conservation agriculture. We're going to need different tools, more tools in our armory to help manage these weeds in those systems. So to date, there are obviously further out in the future some really interesting approaches around robots and more technology, but to date we've been looking at introducing inter-row hoeing into a narrow row crop. So these are, at the moment, 16-centimetre rows, so narrow row crops. And you can see we can combine an in-crop herbicide with the inter-row hoeing, either in a wide row or a narrow row, to just substitute for that lack of contact-acting herbicide that we have in blackgrass. I think that's a really interesting opportunity. If the balance of costs of using pesticides change, or we see pesticide reduction targets, this may well be a technology that we need to use. We've moved on, my colleague Will Smith at NIBE has moved on and started to look at, because we're using inter-row hoeing to control the weeds in the inter-row space, we don't need to use a selective herbicide in that space. So we can reduce our herbicide input by only using the selective herbicide on the crop row, relying entirely on the mechanical weeding in the inter-row space. And one of the things that Will's done is to prove that concept. We can maintain weed control with a banded herbicide operation combined with inter-row hoeing, maintain weed control but reduce herbicide inputs. So even on a 17-centimetre row system, we're reducing herbicide inputs by 2/3. So moving forward, what we're evaluating at the moment, particularly in no-till systems, is whether we can use weed seed capture approaches effectively. So we're talking about seed mills, which have come from Australia, so-called harvest weed seed capture, but also not forgetting that there are pre-harvest surfing approaches. This is actually a zern top cut and collect that we can use, again, to substitute for some of that weed control that we may be, there may be a deficit in some of these systems. So we see not just emerging problems with respect to herbicide resistance, but we see emerging problems in terms of some of the weeds that we're seeing in conservation agriculture systems. So we're seeing failures of biosecurity around non-crop species. So we talk about some of these parasitic weeds, Orobanche, and this Cuscuta, Dodder, coming in where we're using lots and lots of imported legume seed. There are several examples of this. This is a Echinocloa cruscalii that's coming in a game cover. So if we're going to diversify, move towards soil conservation management, more environmental approaches to farming, we do need to be aware of the weed problems that come along with it. We see, as you have, the emergence of rat's tail fescue. It's a very rare occurrence in arable fields, but in no-till systems, where it had previously been excluded by cultivation, we see an awful lot of rat's tail fescue. We also see something that's called bird chervil in our systems as well. And lastly, I want to talk about the elephant in the room. If we are going to make a transition to conservation agriculture, no-till systems, we are changing the balance of weed control. We are increasing the amount of weed control that's done in our rotation with glyphosate. We're increasing the pressure on glyphosate. We're losing mechanical weeding. We're diversifying the rotation, so we've got more gaps between the crops where the weeds can become well established. This increases the pressure on glyphosate effectiveness in the rotation. We are beginning to see in the UK shifts in sensitivity with respect to glyphosate. And this is a massive risk for us going forward. So at the moment, the highest risk that we see is in Italian ryegrass. We have a 5-fold difference now between the least and the most sensitive ryegrass populations. So a litre and a half of a 360, which would be our most commonly used active load in glyphosate. We have around about half a dozen ryegrass populations in the survey, which are seeing significantly reduced sensitivity, increased survivorship. If you move up to 3 litres, we have a handful of ryegrass populations which are surviving 3 litres of glyphosate. We now have a single case of suspected Italian ryegrass glyphosate resistance. Not in the field, but we've recovered some plants. So, in a nutshell, we've done very badly and created a real problem for ourselves, but we've shown that through the adoption of integrated weed management, consistent messages across the industry, we're making a much better job of it. But we see new challenges come along all the time, and that's where we've got to. There. That didn't help at all, did it?
More than join us, John. Thank you very much. I'm also going to be joined here on the panel by John Mahan. John is leading the Enabled Conservation Tillage project at the moment, which is almost due to finish, to give us kind of an Irish flavour, and many of you may know John to begin with. Okay, I can see that there are questions. I forgot to mention that there was a poll going on, and the poll basically is asking you, how would you rate weed challenges on you or your clients' farms compared to a decade ago. And not surprisingly, 48% are saying a greater challenge and more expensive control. A third are saying a greater challenge and less effective control, with 11% saying slowly losing the battle. So in other words, they're moving up the graph in terms of the significance and importance of the challenge. Those results don't surprise any of us on the panel, I'm guessing.
No, it was quite expected.
Okay, you're back. You're live now, I think, Vijay.
Okay. So the answer is quite expected, because we know from the ECT project, as we start testing more samples, we are seeing more resistant cases and more difficulty in controlling the resistant population. I think John could add. John.
Sorry.
Okay, you're live now.
Yeah, I would say we've probably a greater challenge, but a lot of it is because we're actually more vigilant and looking for the problems. On the expensive side of it, it is an expensive problem if you get to the stage where you have a problem. And what we're trying to do on the ECT project is to get the awareness there that if you're on top of it and can get in there without building a seed bank, then you don't have the expense that unfortunately the guys in the UK have had the problem with. You know?
On exactly that subject, if I can just jump across to you, John, you had lovely graphical pictures there of the seed head numbers in the different rotational situations. And I can completely say that I'm au fait with those, because the first black grass problem I saw in this country would make an Englishman proud. If you could be proud of having it, it was so bloody bad. But the question that I would have is that was from an early sown winter wheat crop.
Yeah.
What would that picture look like if it was a late sown winter crop, be it wheat or barley? But just say wheat for comparison.
So for wheat, in terms of plant numbers, we reduced plant numbers by about 60% from a month. The actual outcome in treated crops is greater than that because the herbicide efficacy goes up. So the other key plank has been to stop that move to almost drilling in August, drilling in the start of September, to go back a month. And then on average, you would see a reduction in terms of seed return of over 70%. So it's almost like it is almost a straight line as you go through. But obviously, what the experience with delayed drilling is that it's an easier strategy to deploy from an office in Cambridge than it is from a farm. Because something happens and it starts raining and you've lost control. And I think the crucial thing that I say about delayed drilling is we put a lot of stock into it. As you start to do more and more trials, what you find is that if you delay too long and you establish crops in really poor conditions that have got poor competitivity, it can actually be counterproductive from a weed management point of view.
You give them the space.
You give them the space, exactly.
Yeah. Also, just before I go to the questions on it, you mentioned the issue with flufenicet.
Yeah.
And I want to just sort of ask about that, and also to our own people, is it an active that we may lose in the future? Because it seems that the pre-emerge sequence has been by far and away the most successful in the past.
Yeah, so so the pattern of use for herbicides, we lost activity in contact-acting herbicides first, as you've seen, ACCAs and ALS, and then you could mitigate that by going to lots of soil residual, tighten the timings, apply them earlier. You can even sequence residuals through the autumn, and that was fine for a certain period of time, but obviously that switches the selection pressure from the contacts into the residuals. Flufenicet became commoditized. It became available cheap. It's incredibly cost-effective and cheap pre-emergence herbicide, so we were seeing more and more use straight as opposed to mixtures as follow-ups rather than part of the first application. And I think the lesson I would say is that if we continue to use the herbicides in mixtures with modes of action at the most effective, we will lengthen their lifespan. But certainly, flufenicet, in Italian ryegrass populations has failed. It is no longer contributing to control in some of these farms, and that's.
John or Vijay?
I'd just like to bring that on a little bit further. With our herbicides, and many may have been, using reduced rates or not spraying them effective. John mentioned it in his presentation, and Vijay also, that in his trials and his results study showed there they were in trays in perfect conditions. We can't afford to be using reduced rates of the herbicides we have, because we're just going to enhance that resistance a lot quicker and run the risk of losing those chemistries.
So I think reduced rate is an important IPM measure, but you have to make sure that your wheat population is highly sensitive and your population size is small. But if you look like a self-pollinating, like wild oats and bromes that we are seeing, many of the farmers use reduced rate. We haven't seen any full resistance. So, but if you have a blackgrass or Italian ryegrass, you don't want to mess with them. You have to hit with them with the full or maximum rate for effective control.
The one thing that I think I'm hearing from you guys all of the time is that the lifespan of any herbicide is going to be longer if we're using it on a smaller weed population. So we do all we can to knock down the numbers in any other way possible.
Yeah, and the rate at which new herbicides are going to be discovered, new modes, is slowing. So we need to do that to stand still.
Okay. First question is directly aimed at you, John, and it is, do you know how many fields in the UK, many fields in the UK where blackgrass was present, but is now eradicated to zero level? That's the question, and if there is an answer to it, how long did eradication take?
So eradication, no, it's a fool's errand. You can take a zero tolerance approach, people have demonstrated, but the zero tolerance approach goes on forever. You know, you continue to have to go back and pull out individual plants. So if you look on people like Andrew Ward and Richard Hinchcliffe, they've pursued this aggressive strategy of zero tolerance, but it's a continuing thing. They're no longer having to manage it. It's taken them, people like Richard or Andrew, it's probably taken about 6 or 7 years.
And John, is that because of the inherent dormancy that's in the seeds that were shed in the past?
It's because an individual plant can produce, in a gap in a crop, can produce 10,000 seeds. So as a farmer, you have to be 100% effective every single time you're in a field. As a weed, you only have to escape once.
Okay, Vijay, you're under the spotlight here. Have you done any work on resistance to glyphosate in Irish weed populations?
We did some work, and we haven't found any resistance to glyphosate. But with the blackgrass, we are seeing a less sensitivity. Perhaps you have to go with a little bit higher rate than the usual glyphosate 360 product. And with the Italian ryegrass, like John mentioned, we did, with the recommended rate, we have complete control. Whereas we are seeing some sort of less sensitivity in bromes too. But rest of the grass weeds, I think they gave complete control.
I think you showed that at the Crops Open Day in 2021.
Right.
There were plants there that had been sprayed.
Exactly.
That, well, they certainly weren't dead.
There are plants exactly the same, which John is having outside, and even with the ATEX, they have produced dates.
Okay, next question for any of the speakers. Are there other methods or chemical options available to implement stale seedbed techniques without the use of glyphosate?
Cultivation.
So cultivation to kill, cultivation to germinate, and then cultivation to kill.
Yeah. I think if what you're implying is in a no-till system, are there options? At the moment, it's very challenging. You know, we've got things like acetic acid and malic hydrazide, which are contact scorch materials, but they're not systemic, so they're not preventing the weeds from regrowing. We've got people in those systems using crimp rollers and so on, but which are very effective against broadleaf weeds, but don't seem to be very good against grass weeds. So at the moment, it's difficult in a no-till system to see a substitute for glyphosate. That's not to say that we can't develop one.
John?
Yeah, well, cultivations, to get rid of the second, or the population that has come through, really is our only major option there at the moment.
I was looking at the next one for you, Vijay, so I'm going to just try, was canary grass looked at during the survey?
We did, and it was completely controlled by all the herbicides. Yeah.
Okay. Might it be in the future? Because I know some people have it as their major problem.
Yeah. So you mean
in future may it be looked at?
Yeah, but I don't think canary grass is a species to look at because we have more problems with blackgrass and Italian ryegrass rather than canary grass.
Sorry, just on that, in the ECT project, we have a particular farm with the canary grass issue, and we're working on different integrated weed management approaches on that farm. So at the end of the project, we will be able to give some advice on that. But it's predominantly just a spring germinating problem, mainly in spring barley.
Okay. Okay, thanks, John. So the next question it's a very valid one. Is there a genetic test to indicate blackgrass resistance so that we can take a leaf sample and know in the field at whatever time of year that we're dealing with a species that is resistant to some or other chemistry?
Yeah. We have this lamp from the UK for which can give you the test for the mutation within 20 minutes. And for the non-target site resistance, there is a lateral flow device.
There's a lateral, like a pregnancy test kit. The issue with non-target site resistance is there are actually a lot of mechanisms out there, and the genetic basis of the mechanisms is quite complicated. It's detoxification of all sorts of things. So even the pregnancy test kit is vulnerable to false negatives. So for target site resistance, there are these lamp techniques. For non-target sites, so the flufenicet.
But on the assumption that there is something then, Vijay, this one will come back to you. If you go in and test a plant, what proportion of any population is likely to be resistant versus non-resistant to an individual chemistry? As in, how many plants would you need to test to know that you're actually catching the resistance if it's there?
So far, what we do in the glasshouse is that if we found a least sensitive population, then we go and look for the resistance. What is the mechanism present? But we haven't done any test, just going into the field and take the leaf sample and test for resistance. We just do the screening, initial screening, and once we find the resistance, then we look for the mechanisms.
Okay, but do we know what percentage of a resistant species would be in a population in the field?
Just on that point, what we've been trying to do in the project is trying to encourage people to bring their samples, like as Vijay even mentioned there. You've only one chance a year on actually doing that, coming up to harvest. So if you really suspect you have blackgrass or any problem weeds, you must come on. We'll get the samples into us. We'll do the tests, and then through that process, we'll have a better national figure as to what the resistance is. But again, not enough samples are probably coming through the system to give you a true figure on that.
Okay, thanks, John. And I know I'm against the clock, but I also know I can rob a little bit of time. If you're getting panicky over there, John, give me a holler to tell me shut up. But the next one is one that we don't want to contemplate, which is what happens if we lose glyphosate in any of these scenarios?
I update my CV and think about transferable skills, and then get another job. I mean, seriously, we can grow crops without glyphosate. We just use physical, mechanical weeding. The issue with the lack of glyphosate is that we want to move in a soil conservation management, conservation regen ag direction, and that at the moment, in order to do that, we need glyphosate.
Okay. I'm going down to the top one now. Rat's tail fescue.
So I don't know whether I disagree or whether I didn't hear, but we think ALS herbicides work well on rat's tail fescue, but only if they're applied early. So in us, we encourage people to use autumn applications of ALS herbicides. Well-timed so true pre-M, 48 hours of drilling pre-Ms, including prosulfocarbon, flufenicet, and simethylin, also give good activity. It's variable, but we do have options.
Okay, so I can just lead straight on to the next question. Has the new active simethylin been tested against Irish blackgrass populations?
We have the product, we are yet to test.
Okay, that's easy.
So I'll add, we know that when we've tested simethylin against UK populations, the flufenicet resistance trait is not cross-resistant to simethylin.
Okay.
It has been tested. It's on test on trial in fields in Cork and will be spread out and working well. The problem is when we're going to have it. I think that's been delayed again. Yeah.
Okay, I'm jumping down to the second one here. Any work done on stubble burning and its effect on blackgrass populations? And could this IPM method make a comeback?
As a young man, I was responsible for burning out a Land Rover when we were stubble burning, so I know a lot about it. So yeah, we know that 50% of the seeds are killed directly by the burning, but the main efficacy of stubble burning actually comes from breaking dormancy, getting the weeds to chip, which you can control before you drill. It's fantastically effective. Will it ever come back? Could you get insurance for stubble burning?
I can't see it happening.
Okay, that's it looks to be a no-no. I'm just going to take one last one, if I can. Does the extensive use of herbicides affect soil fauna? It's something that we have to be more considerate of than we might have been in the past.
We haven't done any work on that, Raj. Maybe John could add.
Yeah, so particularly around glyphosate, there's a big focus on glyphosate. We know that using glyphosate specifically has an effect both on soil, fauna and flora, microbial and fungal. But to me, you have to put that in perspective. The alternative is to use a lot of soil movement, which has an even bigger effect on those traits. So let's put it in perspective. We need to steward herbicides. We have a responsibility about the way we're using herbicides to minimize the damage, minimize the use, minimize the externalities of farming. But we know that some of the implications of banning these things are going to be even worse.
Mm-hmm. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I know there are more questions there, but time is a Guinness, as they say, and I've already eaten in a little bit. I'm asked to, before I just leave it, can we thank in the usual way our speakers and John, our panelists? And before I hand over, I'm asked to ask you to complete on Slido a survey of today's events, because what you write there governs what you will get next time around. It's terrific guidance if the people who are here, either here or listening online, if you can just say what you thought is good or bad or indifferent about the day, it helps to guide the process next time around. So I think that takes us to the end, and I just want to invite John Spink to give concluding remarks for the day, and we might just stay here if that's all right, guys.
Okay, thanks, Andy. And you'll be pleased to hear, given the time of day, I won't be as long closing as Frank was opening. So anyway, look, I think we've had a very informative day. There's been a huge amount of information. I hope you'll agree with me. I mean, I've learned a lot. And, I hope that you take something away that you can use on your farm or on your business in the coming season. But not just that, but I think we've heard of, some areas where the prospects of improvements in agronomy and how we grow crops, new, integrated systems of controlling diseases and pests are being developed, but also the prospect of higher value markets for some of our tillage crops. And that's really what we need as an industry, is to add value rather than continually tracing yield and ever decreasing prices, seemingly, over most of my lifetime. I'd like to thank the speakers, and in particular, John and Sasha, who've come over from the UK to talk to us. Very interesting presentations. And also to Ewan for putting together the programme for today. And just to reiterate what Andy said in terms of the exit survey, the conference now has far more short presentations, far more discussion than it would have done a few years ago. 10 years ago, we might have had half a dozen talks going on for 30 or 40 minutes. And that was a reflection of responses to the surveys that people said, you're boring the pants off us talking for 40 minutes. And I think, including more people and more speakers. And you've seen there's a whole very encouraging raft of young researchers coming through in a whole range of areas, which is great for the future of the sector. But I'd also like to thank the rest of the Oak Park team, not just the researchers, but the technicians, the farm staff, the students, because without all of their work, we wouldn't have anything to talk to you about on a day like today. And also then a particular thanks to Eleanor, who's probably not here, but her team, Sharon, Claire and Mary, who deal with the reception and registration, but they were also here till fairly late last night, making sure everything was set up ready for today. And I'd also like to thank you for attending, whether that's in person or online, and also, for the insightful and interesting questions, because we've had more discussion sessions today than we would have done in the past, and without your questions, they'd fall quite flat. So in terms of other people that I need to thank, I want to thank Siobhan for chairing a session for us. and wish her the best of luck in her new job as tillage editor at the Farmers Journal. But we could hardly leave it, Andy, without thanking you. Well, first of all, you made a vacancy for Siobhan to get a new job. But I mean, you've been a huge support to Oak Park and to the Crops Research Programme. You've been on I don't know how many of these conferences you've helped with over the years, and I won't ask you to add them up. But you've been on the Tillage Stakeholder Group since it started, and in terms of advice and steering the work and helping us in Oak Park to try and support the tillage sector, you've been a huge help. And Deirdre, we have just a small gift for you, Andy, to, I guess, remember your retirement, or your retirement as tillage editor, although none of us really believe that you're retiring at all. So Deirdre's just got a plough, given the discussions that we've just had about the lack of glyphosate and the need for cultivations. So Deirdre, would you go and give that to Andy? And while you're doing that...
Thank you very much. Nice to see you. Thank you very much. And best of luck in the new job and fitness too. Well done.
But Andy, I think we all know that you're not really retiring. You're just not tillage editor of the Farmers Journal anymore, and that you have a huge interest in soil, and that you're going to have a long and very active retirement. So we thought we'd also give you a new spade to put in the back of your car.
Thank you very much, John. I know what to do with that anyway.
Okay, so that's the end of the conference. I hope you've all found it a useful day and safe home.